My name is Jeff Morgan. I'm from Dallas, Texas. And for a few minutes, I'd like to talk about the impact of divorce on children. Too often when the topic of divorce comes up, the attorneys start arguing on behalf of the parents. This parent does not want to live with that parent. This mother does not want to live with that father. We should not force them to stay in a marriage. And yet, shortly thereafter, the attorneys will talk about the best interests of the children. And in fact, the Texas Family Code talks about the best interests of the children being the primary interest in divorce matters. What they don't talk about, though, is how children are affected and impacted by divorce. They argue for divorce on an adult level, and then they start to argue about the divorce settlement on the child level. Why don't we reverse this? Why don't we look at divorce and its impact on children? So in this article that I'm reading from right now, they gave some impacts that divorce has on children. Contrary to the popular belief advocated by some, that children are resilient and the children will be happy if their parents are happy. And all we have to do is settle this divorce and get it done so kids can get on with their lives. Divorce has a long-term impact on children. And they listed just 12 impacts. The first one was, number one, children from divorced families died almost 5 years earlier than those from intact families. So as parents, you should know that if you are going to get a divorce, you are quite likely sentencing your children to a shorter lifespan. It is not just about you, it needs to be about the children. Divorce has an impact on children. The second impact was this: facing parental divorce during childhood was the single strongest social predictor of early death. So to add on to impact number one, impact number two says divorce during childhood was the single strongest social predictor of early death many years into the future. Number three, having one's parents divorced during childhood was a much stronger predictor of mortality risk than was parental death. Divorce in childhood is a much stronger predictor of a mortality risk than your parents' mortality. Isn't that interesting? But children are resilient. Children are happy if their parents are happy. Children will recover from a divorce. We need to wrap up this divorce so that the children can move on with their lives. And yet this study is showing that actually children don't just move on with their lives. They die almost 5 years earlier. Divorce is the single strongest predictor of early death many years into the future. And having one's parents divorced during childhood was a much stronger predictor of mortality risk than was parental death. Number four, the experience of parental divorce was strongly linked to earlier mortality from all causes, including accidents, cancers, and cardiovascular disease. So here's what's actually happening, and people don't talk about this. When parents get divorced, it's as if they have just shot a bullet and has a time-delayed effect, a time-release delayed effect on the children. They get divorced, and you are sentencing your children to an earlier death in many instances, and the experience of parental divorce was strongly linked to earlier mortality from all causes, including accidents, cancers, and cardiovascular disease. Number five, for boys whose parents divorce, the risk of dying from accidents and violence was particularly robust as they grew up to be more reckless. Without having the family unit intact, the boys started to act more recklessly, which also led to earlier deaths, in particular from accidents and violence in boys' lives. Parents, if you are getting divorced, you remember this. This divorce is not just about you, it is affecting your children. Number six, overall children's standards of living decreased on average when their parents divorced, but the psychological effects of divorce went way beyond the economic changes. You think that maybe divorce is not going to impact your children? You are absolutely wrong. And not only does divorce bring negative economic repercussions, but even more so, the psychological effects went way beyond the economic changes they experience in their lives. Parents, if you get divorced, this is what you're doing to your children. You need to know this. Number seven, Girls and boys from divorced homes tend to end their education earlier than those from intact families, with the expected problems that ensued. So if you look at children from divorced families and compare them to children from intact families, children of divorced families have a much higher dropout rate from high school. They are much less likely to go to college, much more less likely to finish college if they do go to college, much more less likely to achieve a professional certification than children that come from an intact family. Parents, you need to know this. Your divorce will impact your children. Number 8, boys and girls from divorced homes were more likely to smoke and drink when they got older. Is it any wonder? As compared to peers from intact families. Parents, if you start lecturing your kids about the evils of smoking and drinking after you've gotten divorced, you may want to look in the mirror. Number 9, girls from divorced families were 100% more likely to become heavy smokers. Once again, impact number 9 for girls. They were 100% more likely to become heavy smokers than girls from intact families. Number 10, those who had lived through their parents' divorce when they were children were more likely to have their own marriages end in divorce, thus perpetuating the vicious cycle. Again, parents, if you go through divorce, don't be surprised if your children end up going through divorce as well. Divorce tends to be transgenerational. They have learned this from you. Now, maybe you've learned this from your parents or from somebody else in your family. But if you divorce, the impact on your children is they will be much more likely to divorce in the future. Number 11, a positive family environment. Having positive feelings about one's families did not ameliorate the detrimental effects of divorce. Boys with positive family feelings lived shorter lives, as it was especially traumatic to have a seemingly positive, functional home torn apart. Parents, if you think that divorce is just about you and not about the kids, you are absolutely wrong. If you choose to get divorced, you are affecting your children. And as this said right here, when you have children that come from marriages in which they think that the family is intact, it's functioning positively, and you get divorced, they have a tendency to live shorter lives. Parents, this is on you. Quit getting divorced. Number 12, and this one is more for the men than for children. Men who divorced were at a much higher mortality risk than those who remained married. Even remarried men did not live as long as those who stayed steadily married. Divorce is just an adult decision. It's just about two individual adults, and they've decided they don't want to make it work. And they're going to pretend that it has no impact on the children. You are either deceiving yourselves or you're being lied to. If your attorney is telling you this, that you can pick up and move on, we need to wrap things up. As one attorney from the Texas Family Law Association said, we just need to wrap this thing up quickly so the children can get on with their lives. She lied to you. Those attorneys are lying to you. And if you believe that it's not going to affect your children, you're lying to yourselves. Once again, this is found on www.divorcereform.us, Coalition for Divorce Reform, the impact of divorce on children. And there are studies that back this up. You can look at that if you want to read this article, look at the footnotes. If you choose a divorce, it's not just an adult decision. Divorce affects children. And you need to be aware of that. And you need to not deceive yourself and not lie to yourself, saying that the kids will be okay. The kids will be happy if we're happy. You're wrong. In most instances, the kids are devastated, and the impacts are not just short-term, but long-term. Thank you.